We've been talking about model selection, and one thing which can be a little bit confusing is figuring out what are these complexity controlling parameters. Sometimes there's not really a clear-cut distinction between the complexity controlling parameters and the other parameters, but I wanted to give you some guidelines for thinking about which of the parameters are going to play a role in model selection. So this is complexity controlling parameters. One sort of criterion which can be used is that they're not parameters that are used to fit the data. They're not used to fit the data. So what does this mean? Remember back up here to the regression example, always a good example to think about. W, the vector W, was being used to fit the data, right? When we choose a particular value of W for a particular basis function in order to try to get it near the data, right? But B, this complexity controlling parameter, the number of basis functions, was not really, I mean, in a sort of weak sense it was. So again, so this is not, there's not a clear-cut distinction, but B was clearly controlling the complexity, whereas each of these individual ones was pretty clearly not controlling the complexity. And furthermore, B was not really, affecting the fit to this particular data. So a complexity controlling parameter, one way that you can sort of think about them is that they're not used to fit the data. Another criterion in Bayesian models, so in Bayesian models, the complexity controlling parameters, or the model parameters, tend to be hyperparameters. What's a hyperparameter? So a hyperparameter, put that in quotes, a hyperparameter is a parameter, i.e. parameters of the prior distribution. For example, over here in the Bayesian, where'd it go? The Bayesian linear regression, we had this parameter sigma squared, and this was a parameter of the prior distribution on W, right? So this is a hyperparameter because it's a parameter of the prior distribution. And so this was also a complexity controlling parameter. And this is a fairly typical thing that to happen, is that oftentimes you think of the hyperparameters as being model parameters or model selection parameters. So I just wanted to just briefly give you this little suggestions for how to sort of think about these, but also I wanted to say that there's not really a clear-cut distinction between what is considered the model, what are the model part of the parameters and what are the parameters part of the parameters. And so you pretty much just have to use your best judgment, and most of the time in a particular case it'll be pretty clear as to which are which. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. I guess the one last thing to mention is that these complexity controlling parameters often, I mean, coming back to our original, the original thing here, the complexity controlling parameters, they control how much data, how many different data sets your model can explain. So they control the flexibility to fit or explain the data. And that's what it all really comes back to. So when you're using your judgment to figure out which are the model parameters, then this is really the key thing to think about. Which parameters control this flexibility?